Hey, listeners, this is Tony Buffum, co-founder and chief strategy officer of Human Cloud. Thanks again for joining our podcast. You know, at Human Cloud, we're here to do everything we can to accelerate the adoption of the flexible workforce for all companies. And the podcast guest I have today is a great example of how we can try to make connections to make that possible. That's Paul Vallee. Paul, it's so great to have you on. And I know you're going to be talking about Tehama, the business that you created and lead. But first of all, I just want to welcome you to the podcast and ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself, just who you are and your background.
Oh, well, thanks for having me, Tony. I couldn't be happier to be here. I guess in terms of introducing myself, I am a lifelong responsible data custody enthusiast. I
There's
have
not a whole lot of
essentially
people that I think can say that. So
Yeah, essentially,
you
I
started.
built my entire career around how do we operationalize the best practices possible to be responsible custodians of our data depositors, whoever that might be. Oftentimes it's customers, sometimes it's public stakeholders who trust us with their banking or credit card data. But doing that responsibly requires us to be thinking about cybersecurity and compliance, and that is essentially how my career developed. When I was in my 20s, I founded a company called Pythian, which became a 550 person remote data platform operations and outsourcing business. And in 2019, I founded Tehama, which is the business I'm currently operating. And when I founded it, I spun it out of Pythian. So Pythian was transacted. I'm no longer involved in its operation, but the experience I had there is still very formative. And the reason it was formative is because, at Pythian, starting in 97, I had a front row seat to just about every governance innovation in the world in terms of data stewardship and privacy. So I saw European privacy morph into GDPR. I saw HIPAA get launched in the USA in 2000, Canadian privacy, Australian privacy, but also the credit card standards like PCI, the critical infrastructure standards like the FERC-NERC CIP. I could go on and on. It's an acronym, alphabet soup
I was
that
going to say, it sounds like
just about every compliance innovation under the sun, I had a front row seat. And then that experience led me to be a founding member of the Digital Governance Council of Canada, which is our national standard setting body for matters of digital governance. And it also led to me to be invited to be a senior fellow with CG, which is a global top 30 think tank called the Center for International Governance Innovation. So basically, this is my bag professionally. That's what I do.
well, as you describe that, sometimes when I tell people, hey, I'm really passionate about the flexible workforce, they're like, how did that happen? Tell me what was the canon event in your life that made you so passionate about what I think most listeners will think is kind of a niche space?
Yeah. Well, actually, it's interesting because it came as a result of a personal incident where my own bank, so this is while I'm CEO of Pythian, but Pythian might still be a pretty small business, maybe a 100-person company at the time. But my own bank leaked my private data, including my social insurance number, which is Canada's version of an SSN, of social security number. And that has led to essentially a constant nagging concern and an incident roughly every couple of years where somebody uses that information to, it's happened to me that somebody used that information to open a credit card in my name at another bank. So some identity theft. Somebody has used that information to register themselves as the depositor for my tax returns with the Canada Revenue Agency itself. So this is a constant threat and a constant concern. But I would say if there's a Batman formative moment, it's got to be when I was myself faced the consequences of some irresponsible data custody, and had to, essentially adapt my entire way of vigilance with about my data as a result. I mean, responsible data custody matters to all data depositors, whether they are commercial or personal. And I think it's also fundamentally in our society right now, pretty deeply ingrained in the fabric of trust as to how we can do the things that we do.
Increasingly so. I feel like every new innovation, every year, it's really exciting to see the new technology advances, but it's also a little scary. How do we protect, especially for new companies and of course for huge companies, how do we protect all that data? How do we make sure it's secure? How do we make sure all of our interactions meet the compliance expectations that seem to be changing constantly? So I get the value prop of having a partner that knows that. I would think my first assumption is most companies would say, yeah, but we need to own that and do that internally because it's such a big part of how we operate. So we just have to make sure we got a way to do it. What do you see the same thing where they think they can do it, um, versus the level of expertise you have externally?
So what's interesting is that in my work in the Digital Governance Council, we work partly on digital sovereignty. And what you're describing is a very important concept in digital sovereignty, which is that your own corporation has its own idea of sovereignty. And outsourcing, especially of critical functions, is perceived as risky and dangerous, partly because you're abandoning your sovereignty over your capability. Good examples of that is, for example, your vendor goes out of business, or your vendor goes rogue, or your vendor makes a bad talent decision, and now you're faced with the consequences of
Yeah.
that. And this happens all the time. If you remember the major, if the incident is so large, we can just call it the Target incident. But if you
When you said
remember that
major, the
incident,
first thing I thought was Target.
yeah, if you
Yeah.
remember that incident, it was actually an HVAC vendor to
Yeah.
one of their data centers that was the vector by which all that data was lost. And you can see how, wow, you can see how rational it is to think, you know what, I need to control over all of this. Interestingly enough, that sovereignty movement is being mirrored in the software as a services market as sovereign SaaS. And sovereign SaaS means software that has all the benefits of SaaS. It has, very low upfront capital costs, very easy implementation costs, very elastic costs to how much you use it, very elastic costs to stopping to use it. You stop using it, you stop paying for it. These are what we love about SaaS. But what we normally hate about SaaS is that the SaaS vendor has access to our data and can change our config anytime they want. So they are in the envelope of trust. In a sovereign SaaS deployment, the vendor has no access to the customer's data or networks and has no ability to change the configuration of the software post deployment without the explicit and collected signature of approval from the customer. And so, I guess what I would say to you, Tony, is yes, we see that a lot. And yes, it is a rational concern. So I'm not saying at all, poo poo, don't worry, you can trust everybody. It's not true. But even in a world where that concern is rational, there are architectures or software deployment that maintain the exact sovereignty that you want. And our product is one of those. So if you look into my product, there's a deployment model called self-custody. And
Exactly.
self-custody for our platform means that they're installing our software with the benefits of SaaS, but without my company or any of my employees having access to the data or networks or configuration.
Yeah, that's exactly. I read about that recent. I feel like that's relatively recent. 2025. Is that correct?
Yeah, and this is a recent development and movement in software in general. So we're one of the first companies to really champion this.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Target because it's events like that have a chilling effect on the market where everybody says, "Whoa, we don't." If it could happen to them, they're massive. Then it could definitely happen to us. So we're better off just not having contractors or having really tight rules that don't give them any access, which really limits enterprise participation with the contract, freelance, independent world that we at Human Cloud really work to elevate. So how do you help them get over that hurdle? Is it through things like self-custody, or are there other things that help them kind of bridge that gap of fear around just the level of risk associated with working with contractors versus the benefit of working with contractors?
Yeah, this is such a very, very thorny and interesting. And thorny and interesting also translates to fun if you're somebody like me. But it's a very thorny and interesting conversation and a very thorny and interesting question. So one of the things that we've learned is that when a workload requires a very high level of trust, you can implement technology solutions that amplify the trust that you can delegate to the individual. And I'll give you a quick, easy example. In a casino, and I don't run a casino, but in a casino, you know that they need to trust the croupier to run the roulette table. But they don't trust them so much that they don't have cameras over top
Right.
observing them. Okay. So what is the camera? The camera is a supervision technology that permits them to trust the croupier more. So whatever amount of cash you could trust them with, another way to think about this is from a market perspective, whatever amount of cash you could trust them with if they weren't supervised, I think we can agree, having the cameras there lets you trust them with
Even
more
more.
cash.
Yeah.
Okay, that exact same dynamic applies to the talent market broadly told. What we see is a lot of technologies that have the fundamental purpose to amplify how much trust you can extend. Um, Tehama as a product was built years and years ago, and already starting in 2012, which is when the predecessor to Tehama called Adminiscope was launched, we had customers that were demanding that our access to their systems would be recorded, and that means having a keylogger and having a recording of the screen. Now, I want to point out I'm a privacy advocate, and I fundamentally believe that you should not record people while they're performing private work. And what that means is, if they are able to surf the web or check their Facebook messages or check their stock quotes, you shouldn't be taking a recording of that work.
Sure.
But a lot of third-party contractors should not be surfing the web on those machines. They have their own laptops for that. They should not be Facebook messaging on those machines. They have their own laptops for that. What they should be doing instead is helping you manage your Oracle database or helping you manage your healthcare system or other activities where they don't have an expectation of privacy. And in any world where you don't have an expectation of privacy, session recording, including in Europe in the GDPR space, by the way, session recording is the first line of defense for amplifying the amount of trust that you can extend to a person. And that comes to bear in two situations. The first one is privilege access management, where someone is going to be, for example, administering a credit card database. And that means that, part of their responsibilities is to take backups, recover, establish the integrity, performance tune a credit card database. And in that space, this individual has the passwords that they need if they wanted to steal them. Okay. But we trust them to not. But we trust them to not partly because we know we could put them in prison if they did.
Yeah.
Why? Because we had that session recording. Okay, so we've amplified how much we can trust them, thanks to having that recording capability. But it also happens for freelancers. Often enterprises, when they're engaging freelancers, are concerned about how much they can trust these, are very distant arm's length third parties. And in order to amplify their appetite for trust, they let them know, look, you have your own laptop, you do all your private work on your own laptop. Anything that you're not willing to do in front of us, please just don't use this machine to do it. Like just turn down the work instead. But what they've discovered is that they are able to trust freelancers more thanks to building a data enclave like our technology builds. And maybe I should explain what a data enclave is in a second. But a data enclave that creates those trust dynamics.
You mentioned your own machine. So does this all happen on, say, for a contractor, company deployed machines, or is there a virtual desktop solution that you also provide?
So if you're a large business, maybe you're a bank, and you're employing another large business, maybe we're describing Bank of America's relationship with Wipro or something like that. In that situation, Bank of America expects Wipro to have not only laptops provided to their team, but maybe even Wipro to have those laptops operated at a security standard of care that they can review and that is audited and that they can provide a certificate for, and they can decide that standard of care is appropriate for us so we can permit that Wipro managed machine to join our networks or maybe whatever. Freelancers often are running on their own machines that are they bought at the local corner store and have been configuring themselves, and the employer then has the concern, is this the machine that you let your 15-year-old pirate games on at night, and all kinds of other very legitimate concerns about how that machine is secured and operated. In that model, it is basically impossible to responsibly extend trust to that machine that is being managed by the freelancer. And the solution is to extend a virtual machine. But a virtual machine is an enclave is much more than a virtual machine. A very brief definition of an enclave is a cloud-hosted network in which you can host a suite of virtual machines that are governed and drift managed. And then inside those virtual machines, you have the three onlys. Only the data explicitly permitted, using only the apps and networks explicitly permitted, and only the people explicitly permitted. And importantly, when I say explicitly permitted, I mean collecting the signatures of those permissions so that you have accountability and you know that, Sarah signed off on this configuration or Joshua signed off on, this person having access. And then finally, with a high integrity and immutable audit trail of all of those permissions so that you end up with a audit trail not only of why your configuration permitted this, but also what somebody did while they were enjoying those privileges. And that's called a data enclave. We're not the only company in the world that builds them, but we take pride in the fact that we were one of the first to build them, and we have one of the more sophisticated and mature capabilities in the market.
Are there how would you compare the pros and cons to shipping physical equipment versus the enclave?
Yeah. Well, I would say that one of the challenges with physical laptops that has been a long-standing nagging challenge is the cost and logistics burden. Okay. The logistics burden, obviously the cost of buying a laptop is there. The logistics burden takes the shape of, well, when you buy a laptop from Dell, it's not running your image. So you can't connect it to that Citibank or Bank of America perimeter or that hospital perimeter or that publicly traded company perimeter or whatever. You need to actually not ship it to the user. You need to ship it to your IT team so that they can image it properly. Once it's properly imaged, then they need to ship it to the user. But of course, the user is inevitably going to drop it, spill coffee on it, or otherwise lose it, and then that causes a very high cost burden due to lost productivity. And then inevitably, that individual is going to get fired or quit the job. It's inevitable. I mean, it's part of you know what the turnover rates are. People will a good stint is 4 years, but that means that half your laptops are going to be in somebody's hands during the end of that person's time with your business. That means now the logistics burden of trying to get it back, and then the massive logistics burden, and don't underestimate this, of making it someone's job to get Q-tips and alcohol and try to get the grunge out of it, which is not a job anybody wants. So that is the traditional problem of the laptop shipping. I will say that there is a new emerging problem in laptop shipping, especially for developer enablement, which is that we are facing a global memory and CPU compute shortage right now. And enterprises that are planning on a 3-year horizon are discovering that the amount of memory and compute that they want to give a senior developer or an architect now, especially someone working in data science, is either unaffordable or difficult to procure, or they can't, have cost certainty for what that's going to cost over, in a year or in 2 years. Cloud-hosted virtual software engineering environments built in data enclaves is a very obvious way to resolve that problem. So it's a new thing in the con column for shipping laptops is even access to a properly configured engineering workstation.
Well, and what you described as you're talking through the process, and I've lived that before, all I'm thinking about is slower, longer. And that's assuming that you've got the right forecast to anticipate that you're going to have everything ready. So if you bring on, whether it's new employees or contractors, that you're going to have the inventory you need to get them to work, they're all imaged and ready to go, or that you have to go through that process.
Yeah,
Whether you do or not, it's slowing down your organization, even if you
Tony,
just leave all the equipment deployed in the field when they're done.
it's slower, it's more expensive, and it's less
Certain.
secure. And it's less secure. It's more expensive partly because that laptop that is in someone's physical possession now becomes part of your enterprise data footprint, which means that you have certain responsibilities to how it is secured, how it is managed. But of course, if it's in someone's physical hands, they they now have access to they're now custodians of some of your enterprise data, and that becomes a major responsibility to administer as well. So it is slower for sure. It's also more expensive because there's just more stuff you need to secure and operate, and the logistics that I described and the lost productivity costs that I described. But most importantly, it's also less secure, and the reason is that your enterprise data estate sprawls when you put it into freelancers' hands, which is fundamentally one of the demand limiters for freelance work in general, is the enterprise's concern about the cybersecurity posture of engaging them and sharing data with them.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we talked about this briefly, but as I met with a bunch of executives last week at an event, and we talked about the opportunity that exists with tapping into freelancers, contractors through marketplaces, or other avenues, other channels. The biggest One of the biggest questions was, well, what about security? That's our concern. We're XYZ type of company, especially I know from experience when I was at FLIR Systems, we started working within this environment. Of course, I brought Upwork in and really wanted to make sure that we found ways to use them. And we were under a compliance agreement with the government. So
Mm-hmm.
everything set to agreement, it's a compliance, but you get like a heavily restricted environment where we already had restrictions on tons of our employees and our non-US employees. And so immediately the mentality was, well, we can't possibly do it here.
Yeah.
Thankfully we found a way, but it's easy, I think, for enterprise leaders to think, hey, that sounds great, Paul. That's great for like mom and pop companies and small businesses, but big enterprises, especially those in healthcare that have government contracts and banking, we can't do that. It's too risky. We're risk averse. It needs to be hands off. So I guess we're just going to miss out on this fantastic talent pool because we're better off just focusing on full time or large corporate partnerships.
Yeah. So I think compliance is a factor. There's a lot of the industry that is lightly regulated. So not everything is a bank or a healthcare company or the government itself, right? And so even in lightly regulated enterprise, responsible CIOs are very concerned about the integrity of their cybersecurity posture and the trust that they can extend to their teams. In a compliance sensitive world, like for example, in the US, the Department of War has rolled out the CMMC rule this year. CMMC stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And what's important about the CMMC is for the first time ever, the 200, possibly some say as many as 400,000 global businesses that supply the Department of War or the Department of War's suppliers, meaning the nested supply chain, the
Yeah.
umbrella supply
Gotcha.
chain that builds that capability globally, which includes, I mean, it's going to include a drywall contractor in Germany near the base. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
They need to certify against 110 controls in the NIST 800-171 controls library in order to satisfy a third party auditor to certify that they are CMMC compliant. Now, obviously, the CIO who wants to achieve CMMC compliance is going to be thinking, oh my God, like the last thing I want to do right now is throw random freelancers at this problem space. I'm never going to pass because they're thinking that they need to certify these freelancers' laptops as compliant. And the compliance standard, to give you an idea, is not only the laptop. There's shredders that are compliant because they cut it down to the right size, and there's shredders that are not compliant, and you're not allowed to shred a document in that shredder. So it becomes like a massive headache. Adopting an enclave, though, is the shortcut to being compliant in that context, and it's not limited to the Department of War. The GSA has recently published a new rule called the 21-112 rule, or CIO IT Security 21-112 is the name of the document. And in it, they are also adopting the same hundred and something controls library as the Department of War. And HIPAA has proposed new a new public rulemaking proposal that will be approved in April, possibly as early as next month. And HIPAA is going the way of PCI, which is to say, HIPAA is for the first time going to be prescriptively enforcing cybersecurity posture and compliance checks, and with the hammer of a $2 million fine in the event companies are perceived as negligent implementing those controls. To make a point at the end of that narrative, the answer is, if you adopt the right technology for cybersecurity and compliance, one of the benefits you have is to be compliant and avoid the $2 million fine. But another benefit is now you have a vehicle by which you can enjoy access to your holistic workforce, which includes contractors and third parties, even if they're small, even if they're a drywall installer or a plumber. Why? Because if you host your data in an enclave and you grant them access to a desktop that you have custody of in your enclave, the data is not changing custody. You're the responsible custodian. And as a result, you're not trusting that freelancer with data at all. You're just consuming their work effort by dragging it directly into your custody through what amounts to very long virtualized monitor, keyboard, mouse tables that extend into their physical presence.
Yeah, as I read up about your business before we connected, I saw that zero trust come up a lot, and it's funny because it's a term that sounds almost offensive, like we trust absolutely nothing, but
Yeah,
also at the same time it makes you feel very secure. Like
I think that's
if we
why
have zero trust, then you can it actually gives you trust in that you're going to get the output securely.
I caught on as a buzzword. But what zero trust really means is that by default, an individual who is engaged with your business has access to nothing. That's what zero trust fundamentally means. And that you then extend to them the trust that they need on a session by session basis, which means that if they don't do that work anymore tomorrow, they should not have access to it all starting tomorrow. And on a session by session basis, you extend to them only the trust they need, the minimum trust that they need in order to successfully execute the work that you are properly delegating to them. And this is fundamentally a principle and an architectural principle that that protects enterprises from rogue actors, partly because those rogue actors will find themselves frustrated as they attempt to go rogue because they will not have the permissions that they need to access stuff that is not in their direct delegated responsibility. And that's what's good about it, really, is that, if you think of Ed Snowden as the SharePoint, politically, whether you think Ed Snowden is a good guy or a bad guy, that's a different question. But from a cybersecurity perspective, very clear, bad guy. Okay, so I don't have an opinion about the first part, but in the second part, that's my world. And as a cybersecurity perspective, this is a very clear bad guy as an insider threat who exploited his privileges to do things that he should never have been permitted to do. And fundamentally, if you think about it, if we had only issued him, if the we had only issued him the privileges that he needed to do his exact job, he would never have been able to do, because his job was not to steal
Yeah,
all that data. He would never have been able to take it.
you'd
And
never be
that's
able,
really,
and
and
you'd have
you know,
well, of course you'd have the audit trail. I would assume you may even have alerts set around like
exactly,
the kind of
exactly.
information he's accessing. And it brings up, like, maybe this is tangential, but it brings up for me, being passionate about the freelance workforce, that oftentimes employers feel like they have they're entitled to a level of pretty relatively loose trust for employees compared to contractors. It's almost like, hey, we hired them full time, so we don't have to worry about them stealing our data. But these people that don't work for us, we have to worry about them. And I've always had the mentality, one, those contractors or freelancers, they work on a reputational basis. They'd have
True.
to really be focused on doing something wrong, to to get in trouble, because that's the last thing they want to do in their job. Not that you should inherently trust them, but don't assume that every contract, if someone's not an employee, then they're out to get you. Whereas
True.
you assume that if someone's an employee, they're definitely not out to get you, which you
True.
just brought up a great internal employee example.
Well, especially because, well, actually, it was an internal employee who stole my bank's data as well, for that origin story. But also, we also know that state actor threats are increasingly placing individuals in positions of trust as full-time employees, and so inside organizations. So we know that all of the governments of North Korea, China, and Russia, at a minimum, are actively trying to infiltrate global businesses with their loyal employees as workers. And so, in the freelance world, it goes without saying that these are also going to be remote workers, and zero trust architectures is foundational to safely engaging that worker. And if someone were to inappropriately infiltrate your workplace, if you've got good security architecture, they will only be able to do their job. They won't be able to do anything else. So how vulnerable are you really in that situation?
I
So,
mean, everything we've so this conversation. If you're not convinced that enclaves are trustworthy, then we haven't done our job because I think you've done a great job of that. But then further, it should also make you feel like that's probably more reliable and trustworthy than some of the internal networks that you have. And
well,
I'm sure
yeah,
organizations use it for both.
one of the things that the average enterprise right now, the average enterprise has a what we call a crunchy exterior and soft meaty interior network, which is to say, they work very hard to harden their external network to try to protect it from hostile attacks or denial of service attacks or what have you. But once you're inside and plugged in and authorized on the network, it tends to be relatively lenient. And there is a danger in that. And it's not only the insider threat danger. If your crunchy exterior were penetrated, there's a blast radius problem. And in the HHS new proposed rulemaking, they explicitly surface how important it is to segment your network in order to reduce the blast radius of an incident.
Mm.
So this is a big thing, and a lot of regulatory innovation is occurring in that space right now.
So we've talked a lot about where we're at. You actually had a recent announcement with this partnership alliance with Dispersive that
Mm,
that listen, I'm not in this space, but it gave me a sign of things to come. Can you talk a little bit more about how that helps enable the future of this type of compliance, security, and remote work?
yeah. So one of the things that we need to be aware of, first principles, one of the things we need to be aware of is that the state of the art in modern networking is not quantum safe. Now, whether you believe that's a problem or not, um, depends heavily on who you're taking your guidance from. However, I think the general consensus is that our current cryptographic architecture probably has less than 5 years to go before it needs a massive overhaul to become quantum safe or quantum resilient. Now, so that's first principle right there. A lot of enterprises that are selecting technologies now have begun to include quantum safety or quantum resilience in their selection criteria. And so that's fundamentally one of the reasons that we wanted to partner with Dispersive on their advanced networking capabilities. The other one, though, which is also just as important, is that our technology, when adopted, becomes mission critical. It's clear that accessing your talent workforce, your holistic talent workforce, whether these are trusted insiders or freelancers or contractors, it's clear that your business's active operation relies on these people being able to connect when they need to. And one of the concerns that larger enterprises share is that of a denial of service attack. One of the ways that, in a cyber war context or in a cyber crime context, one of the ways that you could hold a business hostage is by depriving it of its talent. And so we needed to build a mechanism to reassure those customers. And Dispersive's networking technology is highly durable, highly available, It is also latency optimizing, but from our perspective, it does two major things that are not bells and whistles. It is stealth, so it is undiscoverable, and it is quantum resilient, which means that it does not permit a record now and decrypt later approach to accessing data. And so, yeah, it's a good partnership for us, and I believe this is where a lot of enterprises are headed now. So you'll see that demand for quantum resilient and denial of service resilient networking infrastructure increase over the coming few years.
That makes a lot of sense. With all of that, not only the future capability, but what we need to do to access truly the massive amount of globally available talent all over the world. Um, the biggest the after we get through people understanding the value proposition, the speed, the enablement, the next question is, well, what's the ROI? How do I define or defend the ROI as I'm now convinced that I need to do this, but I've got to bring this inside and get support? How do you usually help your prospects define the ROI so they can become clients and benefit from your partnership?
So ROI takes the shape of two major, if you think of total cost of ownership on the cost side, you can also think of it as a holistic total cost of ownership. And holistic total cost of ownership needs to include not only your cost of acquiring the technology, your cost of operating the technology, but also the cost of the incidents for the technology you've adopted. Okay, so if you think about it, you could spend half as much money on cybersecurity technologies and bear the increased risk,
Yeah.
or you could spend twice as much money and enjoy the lower risk. Your job as a CIO is to minimize your holistic costs, which includes the consequences. Now, it's not only risk to cybersecurity incidents, it could also be, if we go back to the HIPAA new proposed rulemaking, it could also be the risk of the $2 million fine, okay, from
Well,
having leaked
and
the
the rest of
data.
your contracts in and of themselves.
Right,
There's
exactly.
fines, and then
Exactly. Well, this is
you
where I
don't
was
want to lose.
going with the next one. If you go
Yeah.
to the Department of War with the CMMC rule, the risk is that you will not get this contract renewed at all, or in fact, you won't qualify in to bid on the contract at all because you have not managed to certify. So, if you look at the cost model holistically, cybersecurity investments like this pay you back in a variety of ways. One of them is cost avoidance for incidents and fines. One of them is revenue opportunity unlocking for new commercial opportunities. And the traditional one is access to talent and global workforce. Access to talent is a great way to engage the ROI as well. But then we can also go back to shipping laptops being slower and more expensive and less secure. Well, it's actually sometimes being fast and being less expensive on operations and being more secure can also save you a ton of money in the rest of your stack versus the alternative technologies. So this is basically the way you would look at it holistically.
Yeah, well, and you landed on the best one. To me, I like to try to drive this idea of talent access versus acquisition. The more that you can access the talent you need on an on-demand basis, just like you
Mhm.
said, where it's you're paying for what you use versus paying this fixed rate for what you sometimes use and sometimes don't. Gives companies the agility that I think they need, especially now. What they need from a tech skill set, or how the market dynamics might change based on geopolitical issues or just the macro economy. All of that is harder to predict than it was back when I was an operator, years ago. And I only see it getting harder. So if you want agility in your organization, you need to enable talent in this way. But to your point, it's also it, when I talk about this, all I hear is speed to talent, speed to in-demand talent. And if you're doing it the right way, that's likely versus the alternative, less expensive, much more cost efficient, and you're getting really high quality. So you're kind of ticking all these boxes, but you need a way to trust them, which is what got us here in the first place. So this has been an excellent conversation, Paul. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot, but most importantly, I've learned that this is a solution that anybody that's considering working with an extended workforce, really, if they're not already doing it, should be considering. How do they learn more about you, about Tehama, to see if it's a good fit.
Well, I'm an open networker on LinkedIn, so I welcome anybody to send me a message. Doing this since LinkedIn was founded has gotten me something like 11,000 connections so far, and I'm certainly not nowhere near done. So reaching out to me is very easy. All I ask is, start with a social reason to reach out to me, and don't start with a sales pitch because it's just very annoying. You can spend nothing but being sold to all day if you permit it. But the website is tehama.io, and I invite people to have a look at that. I'll be at RSA. So the other major idea is if you're going to what is turned into the world's leading cybersecurity conference in San Francisco later this month, then if you happen to be there, you should reach out for me, and we'll happily meet you there.
That's great. And then, of course, they can go to your company's website, which is tehama.io, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, listen, this has been great. I hope you don't get any sales reach outs. I hope they're all buyer reach
Well, I
out.
don't mind. I don't mind, but don't expect me to engage. That's all. Because you need to be careful with how you allocate your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks a lot, Paul. It's been terrific. I hope we stay in touch, and I really appreciate you joining the Human Cloud podcast.
Right. Thank you. And thank you for a very engaging conversation and my compliments to your audience.
Thanks.
All right.